Good evening and welcome to the Planning Commission meeting on February 6, 2019. I would just like to call the meeting to order. And Karen, would you take roll call?
Connie Coleman-Lackady.
Present.
Donna Daniels is excused. James Guerrero.
Present.
Nancy Hudson-Eccles.
Present.
Ryan Pearson.
Here.
Paul Wagaman is currently absent. Christopher Weber.
Here.
You have quorum.
Thank you. So we have approval of the minutes for January 16, 2019. Has everybody reviewed the minutes? Could I have a motion to accept the minutes?
I make a motion to accept the minutes as written.
Second.
James Guerrero is second. Any comments, adjustments? All in favor of the minutes as presented, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, the minutes have been accepted as presented. Do we have any agenda updates
No, Madam Chair.
from the board? Any agenda updates? So public comments. Mr. Speed? Thank you for being here tonight.
Guess I'm the public tonight. Glen Speed, Lakewood. In reading the zoning and business uses that are in this packet tonight, I have some concerns. I moved to Lakewood in 1963. In 1968, I started a business. In 1977, I moved to my existing place where I opened an antique shop. At the time I bought my place, I went to the county and asked for a rezone. They kind of looked at me and laughed, but their current plan was no rezones in my area for 20 years. They'd planned it out 20 years to be what it is now, or what it was then. When we became a city in 96, the county had rezoned me as MUD, multiple use district. At that time, multiple use district had 119, 120 different business types that could be in that particular zone. So I was kind of current to my zoning with my antique shop. Okay. When we became a city, the city tried to make all kinds of zoning changes. And there were times when I was zoned residential, multiple or duplex, triplex. It finally settled out after about a year and a half to be NC2. Now I see NC2 has got very, very few types of businesses and not one that includes antique shops in my zoning area. It seems like almost all of Lakewood is going to be non-conforming the way things are playing out. So I'd suggest a little bit more study and making sure that the existing businesses that have been there for a long time, and I've been there since 77, so it's 42 years, operating a business, not always successful, but at least try to be successful. And unfortunately, museum or antique shops have become more like museums because there isn't an awful lot of people buying antiques anymore, at least not my kind of antiques. Anyway, I'd like to see you look a little bit more into what can be in certain zoning areas. The next door neighbor that I have is DeLong's Drive-In, and I guess they were zoned NC2. And I don't know that that's even the right zone for DeLong's Drive-In. Across the street used to be NC2, and I think it still is, and there are antique shops and all kinds of businesses, vape shops and other antique shops and so forth. So anyway, I'd suggest you look at that a little bit. And I hate to be non-conforming, and it probably won't affect me until I leave. However, what I can do with the property is obviously affected because it won't be able to stay the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Spieth.
What's that?
I said, thank you, Mr. Spieth.
Okay.
I'm sure Tiffany has made note of that. So now we go to unfinished business. I see we have none, unless, Ms. Beer, do you have any unfinished business?
No, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Public hearings, none. New business, Title 18A update.
Thank you and good evening, Madam Chair and members of the Planning Commission. Tiffany Spear, Planning Manager for Special Projects. So we are going to be talking from a 50,000 foot level tonight to begin, and then start to hone in down on 18A. And this is the first of a series of study sessions that we're going to have for the Planning Commission. The intent is to have kind of phased introduction of different portions of the update that's being considered, and then not only tonight, but on February 20th, March 6th, April 3rd, and May 1st, you'll have discussions. On April 17th is a public hearing. And then at this point, action for you is anticipated on May 15th. So we'll keep talking about this in pieces. But like I said, we're going to start at a higher level tonight. And please feel free to ask questions as I start to go through this information. If you have any, happy to clarify or whatever you may want to spend some more time on. So if you back up to land use law, land use controls in the state of Washington, you start with the Growth Management Act, which is a state statute, and then there's a number of other related laws. There's also critical areas and shoreline regulations, other environmental protections. There's the subdivision law, which is how to physically and legally divide up parcels from one big one to multiple ones. And then there's also the administrative regulations that go along with that. So if you're talking about the revised Code of Washington, the state laws, you also have their administrative counterpart, the Washington Administrative Code, which is where, for instance, there's guidance from the Department of Ecology about how to do a shoreline master program update. But that is in turn coming back from the state statute as the original authorization. State statute, of course, is also where the city of Lakewood gets its authority to function as a city and to govern land use within its borders. So you have that top layer. The next layer down in this upside down pyramid you've got in front of you are regional policies. And the 4 counties within the central Puget Sound, so Pierce, King, Kitsap, and what did I lose? Snohomish, sorry. Those 4 counties are all part of what's called the Puget Sound Regional Council. And that is a regional body that comes up with policies that each of those counties and all of the cities within the county need to follow. And so you have the state law, you have the city of Lakewood authorized to do what it does, but then in between there's these regional policies that are kind of a middle of the sandwich, if you will. So Puget Sound Regional Council comes up with policies that apply to all 4 of those counties. Next layer down in the regional stuff is you have Pierce County and all of its cities. So that layer is another layer of policies which must be followed too. Then we get down to City of Lakewood. City of Lakewood has ordinances and resolutions and code in place. And what we're talking about tonight and moving forward is updating an entire title within that code, both with substantive changes and then also just reorganizing it because some of it's been around for quite a while without any updates. So on the left-hand side, that bigger one, you'll see there's the enabling legislation. This allows it to happen at all. Those regional policies, both for the 4 counties and then for Pierce County specifically. Then you have the City of Lakewood's comprehensive plan and its zoning map. And then you have somebody coming in and trying to pull a permit to follow all of those rules and policies. The comprehensive plan, you also take a look at on a regular basis, and you'll be later this spring looking at the latest docket of amendments that have been brought forward for the comprehensive plan itself, either text or maps. But that zoning map, which you've seen many times, is kind of the Bible, if you will, for land use, meaning you take a look at what something has been zoned, you take a look at what in the code is allowed within that zone, and that is going to tell a property owner, as well as staff, as well as a council, as well as the hearing examiner, anybody dealing with a question about this stuff, what is allowed on that property, either by right or through some sort of conditional approval. Make sense? Keep going? Okay. So this is almost the same information, but in a slightly different way with a little more detail. So again, I mentioned the State Law Growth Management Act, Shoreline Management Act, the State Environmental Policy Act, or SEPA, and then there's regulations that implement all of those things. There's the multi-county planning policies, which is that Puget Sound Regional Council level. Then there's the Pierce County and all of its cities policies. Then you get down into the City of Lakewood itself. It's got its big comprehensive plan, and listed there are all of the different elements within the plan. So there is a chapter within the comprehensive plan talking about land use, but it's policy level. It's not the actual governing code for a project. And then you see also urban design and community character, economic development, transportation, utilities, public services, capital facilities, sustainability, and implementation. So the intent behind a comprehensive plan is for the city to know for a 20-year horizon, in some cases even longer, this is the vision. This is what the people want. This is what the elected body is working and directing staff to help implement. This is where we're all working toward when projects come in and are supposed to be reviewed and approved. And again, right there in the comprehensive plan level, there's that zoning map. And that is where, again, you'll see specific properties are given specific allowed uses or conditional uses based on how they've been zoned. In the municipal code, there are multiple titles that relate to land use, but we're talking just about 18A as we move forward. But just to keep in mind, there's also Title 12, which is public works, infrastructure kind of stuff. There's public utilities. There's environmental protection. So that's where you would find, for instance, the Shoreline Master Program that you're also taking a look at right now. Building and construction in Title 15, that's the physical, how many nails do you put within so many feet on a house wall kind of stuff. Title 17 is that land subdivision process. And then Land Use and Development Code is Title 18A. So within Title 18A, there's a lot of information, but it's part of a bigger puzzle, if you will, related to land use in Lakewood. So any questions on any of that? Any questions?
Yeah, what do you do when you got a conflict?
There will tend to be, at the start of each chapter, if there is a conflict, such and such will govern, or if one's more strict than the others, this one will govern. If it becomes a point where you truly can't reconcile things, then you have to come back to council ultimately and ask for an amendment to the code. But in the meantime, in that wiggle room where the council hasn't had a chance to act yet on something that's a conflict, usually you've got a director, either the planning director or the public works director has discretion to come up with some kind of case-by-case decision on that.
But, you know, one of the things is nice to have local control, right?
Right.
And so Olympia comes up with some harebrained idea, or maybe a good idea, you know, but that starts messing with us down here. So how do we fight that? Is that just in a ballot box?
Ultimately, yes, and through the legislative cycle. So you have the legislature in session right now. It happens on an annual basis, either for a longer or a shorter session every year. And so let's start with point A. You have a new law, a new bill is passed by the state legislature that affects local governments and how they do X. There is an effective date of that bill, and so within the time from when the legislature votes to approve it and that effective date, local governments are supposed to update whatever part of their comprehensive plan, whatever part of their municipal code is needed to get changed to be consistent with that state law. And then if you don't like it, if the cities don't like it, if the county doesn't like it, if people don't like it, it's a matter of, yes, going back and updating those bills with future bills to say, hey, this part of it maybe was a good idea, but it's not working practically, so you need to amend X, Y, or Z. Or this was just a bad idea, it's time to take it back off the books. So that just happens through the voting process and every legislative cycle.
Any other questions? Okay. Oh,
Yeah,
Councilman Branstad.
thank you. Let me just point out as we're embarking on the 18A process that there is a Title 18B. And Title 18B is the Downtown Development Code, which is the action that you spent a lot of last year on being able to go and do that. So that as we are going to be looking at 18A, when we adopted the downtown plan, it created 18B so that the 18A won't be affecting the downtown area in any significant way, because of the fact that there's a sub-area plan that has its own title.
Any other comments, questions? Okay, thank you.
So here is one of two maps. I mentioned the zoning map a couple of times. This one is called the Future Land Use Map. And this is one that you would see if you were to open up the comprehensive plan. So you can see, even if you can't see the words down the right-hand side, you can see things are different colors. And each one of those colors is a particular land use designation. So for instance, the yellow is single family. And then the brighter yellow is single family. The paler yellow is residential estate. So if you were to look up in the code, what do those terms mean? There's actually a density range assigned to each one of those zones. The green, dark green, is open space and recreation. So that's where the city's got parks. The bright blue is the public institution. So that would include schools, Western State Hospital, libraries, I'm trying to think, but that type of building or use on a site. And then you've got some orange, which is the multifamily, so again, higher density there. And then on the right-hand side, or the eastern side of the city, you'll see blue, lighter blue. That is the military air corridors 1 and 2. You've got pink, which is the corridor commercial, so along South Tacoma Way, or I think that's South Tacoma Way, or is it Pacific? Sorry, Pacific. It's both of them, actually. And then up toward where the Walmart is, almost to University Place. So the red in the middle is what Councilmember Branstad was just referring to. That is the downtown sub-area plan footprint that you'll remember from last year. So all of these colors translate into these uses are allowed either by right, or there are things that are conditionally allowed. There's densities, there's design requirements, how you can set out your lot, how much parking you might need to provide. All of those types of things are then handled by the code. But the map is the starting point. I'm going to jump to another map, which looks very much the same, but it is actually different. This is the zoning map. So one way to keep track of this is if you were to go back, go back to the one we were just talking about, and you see there's so many colors and so many listed on the right. Those are the different designations. This next map you'll see has a lot more. And that is because within any of those particular designations, there might be multiple zones. So probably the easiest way to remember this one is in the residential bright yellow that says single family on this land use map. If you go to the zoning map, there's residential 1, 2, 3, and 4. And they would all be within that single family, okay? So there's multiple residential zones within a single designation. Does that make sense? And then same thing with the multifamily, rather than just having the single orangey color on this first map. In the second map, you'll see there's 3, if not 4, multifamily ones. There's a clear zone now in addition to the air corridor 1 and 2 over on the right side, so now you've got some purple shades there. But again, they're close, but they are not quite the same because this second map breaks out in more detail what is specifically allowed on a particular parcel. So when we're talking about 18A, you would be accessing both of these maps if you were a developer or a property owner trying to figure out what you could do on your property. And then that would also show you the terms and the sections of the code that you would then need to go look at to find out what are the rules that I have to play by in order to develop or redevelop or demolish for that matter. So 18A, part of that bigger triangle or pyramid, however you want to describe it. What do you do as a planning commission? Your responsibility is to be looking at the comprehensive plan, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago. So whenever there are those dockets that come up on an annual basis of people want to change the zone on their property. If you'll remember, there were 3 private applications that came in for rezoning property. In some cases, they want to not only change the zone, but they also want to change the designation. So what does that mean? Taking a residential 4 and saying, this needs to be industrial now. And then they would have to justify that, and ultimately the council would have to decide if they were to approve it. But that's changing not only from R whatever to R whatever, it's R to industrial. And so that is a bigger step. That's taking just the zone as well as the designation and making a change. If, on the other hand, you were saying, I'm in R2 right now and I want to change to R4, that's a zone change without having to change the designation. So that's a slightly lesser process that has to be done in approval that's made. So again, you can either change your zone within that larger designation. It could be a commercial corridor, changing it to neighborhood commercial. That's still all commercial, right? Or it could be, like I was mentioning, the residential change to industrial, just for an extreme example. So those are things that happen with the map. If and when map amendments change, then of course the code sections that apply to that property would change. It would no longer be following those old rules with the old zone. It would be what's the new rules based on what has been approved as their new zone. So you're looking at, through the comprehensive plan amendment process, people asking, or in some cases the city asking, for consideration for changes to the zone or the designation of property. Also looking at changes to policy within a comprehensive plan. So economic development is one of the ones that actually is getting updated this year through that comprehensive plan process. So you're going to see applications for zoning or designation changes, and then you're going to see a bunch of text amendments, one of which is revamping the economic development element of the plan, which is all text pretty much. And in this case, it talks about data about demographics of the city, employment information, job opportunities, that sort of thing. Just getting that updated, that'll be something that you take a look at and then make a recommendation to the council as well. And then you're also charged with giving information to recommendations to holding hearings about land use and zoning regulations and then other development regulations. And so you take a look at things as a first step. Public hearing happens here, decision happens here, and that recommendation goes up to the council. So you've done this many times, but just kind of backing up and saying, this is why you're here. What you're going to have with 18A falls under that second bullet, and you're going to be looking at both regulations and to some extent the maps, because part of what's happening, for instance with the military zones, is their boundaries might change based on some of the information that's the basis for the change. The Air Force instruction came out in 2015, which changed a little bit of the rules of where it's safe to have certain types of structures, so many people per acre, and so we need to update what the city has to reflect all of those things, and in some cases that may change the borders of the military zones. So in that case, you may have both text and map changes related to that one item. So as you do your review of 18A and then take your public comment and then decide what you're going to recommend, what you're doing is giving information up to the council. Then they will have their own public hearing, of course, but they're also relying on you to be the subject matter experts, if you were, because you really are focused for the most part on land use and giving them that information. And it just so happens that if all the timing goes right, Your joint meeting with them is going to happen very soon after you get done with the 18A process. And so you guys will be able to actually sit down together. And if you've got questions or concerns, you'll be able to share that with the council face to face, which will be kind of nice. So, any questions on why you're here?
Any questions?
No? All right. So we're going to dive in then. What you have in your packet tonight is an introductory memo for me, which is very short, just not even half a page. And then starting on page 7, you're going to see in tiny print, I apologize, it's this small, but it's really there to kind of give you a sense of what's happening, big picture. If you would like it in a larger format, I'm happy to get something to Karen and she can send it on to you. But showing you how 18A as a whole is being reorganized. So what's on your screens in front of you is just the titles of each of the chapters. Under the current Title 18A, there are 10 chapters, and they begin with 1801 and go up to 18A 90. On the new code, which is on the right-hand side, those are the new numbers. Some of the chapters have the same number, but they may not have the same content. Some of the old names maybe carry over, but that doesn't mean it's the same information. Some of the single chapters out of the old stuff have been divided up into multiple chapters and vice versa. Some of multiple chapters in the old code are becoming a single chapter in the new code. So it is not a one-to-one comparison. I'm just showing you that you have 10 chapters out of the current code switching over into 11 chapters in the new code. Down at the bottom on the right side, you see 18A 95 and 18A 100. Those are being handled somewhat differently. The wireless service facilities, if you'll remember at your January 16th meeting, you guys took action to forward on to the council, and they have now started to talk about updates to the wireless services chapter based on a federal ruling regarding small cells and how those pieces of material can be hung off of utility poles, hung off of buildings, however those need to happen. So that is on its own track. And that will be approved by the council in the not too distant future. And once it's done, it will be an interim control. And then that is being brought in and dropped into 18A just kind of as is. And then signs, of course, are going to be coming up to you very soon. Excuse me, I'm sorry. You finished signs last fall. It's going to be going to the council soon. Sorry. You can have signs again. And that will also just be finished and then be dropped into the big 18A package when they take it as a whole. So if you then look starting on page 7 and move on, you'll see there's many sections on the left-hand side in the current code, and there's many sections on the right-hand side, but the intent is that it is better organized. It's a more intuitive organization, logical flow from start to finish through the code, but there aren't necessarily substantive changes in every single one of these sections. In fact, there's many of them that once they get their renumbering are verbatim from the old code. It's just, it's in a new place now. And then at the very back, you'll see, very back of that, I should say, so on page 17 of 85, you'll see there's a single sheet there with a list of administrative policies. These are policies that have date back in some instances almost 20 years, and these are things that the planning department or community and economic development department have been doing somewhat informally, and because they are still valid and timely, they are getting dropped into the code as well. So they're going to be part of the ultimate package that you're taking a look at within the next few meetings. So I mentioned a couple times now, there's a lot of things that are just reorganized, and then there's some things where there are substantive changes, updates to zones, what's allowed in a zone. There's changes to some of the maps, as I mentioned, related to the military zoning and what's required there. Just by topic, no changes are being made to the locations, the uses, and the regulations for the residential zones R1 through R4. So it's anticipated that there will be initial questions from property owners. You know, you guys are redoing all this stuff and it looks very different now. Are you changing what my house permits are going to be required or something like that? Residential zones R1 through R4, yes, they're going to a new place, but the requirements are not changing. Regulation of animals, so whether they be pets or agricultural, what have you, That is also not changing. And what you'll see on the right-hand side of this chart is where to go if you wanted to look at the language in the new code. That's where you'll see them now. Landscaping and tree preservation are also not going to change, and they are all moving into a single chapter. In the old code, I believe these were separate chapters. Housing incentive programs, that's like Section 8 and subsidized housing policies and rules. Those are staying the same, they're just moving to a new chapter. And then I just mentioned the standard wireless service facilities chapter. The council adopted temporary rules. They had a public hearing this last Monday on that, and then it's moving forward to permanent regulations when 18A rolls it in and it becomes all one piece. Where there are going to be changes, substantive changes, and where you, I would imagine, would want to spend a little bit more time as we move forward, are the zoning districts. So what zones are there in the city? And there's a potential that they could be changed, they might be combined, or they might be left exactly the same. That's really still up in the air a little bit, and that'll be part of what you're making a decision on. Land uses and interpretations. So within a district, there are uses, right? And so actually in tonight's public hearing with Mr. Spieth, when he was talking about our antique shops allowed within the NC2 zone under this new chapter, you would find that answer within the new chapter 18A40, land uses and interpretations. Site planning and development standards, that's when you're really getting into the guts of if you're gonna develop a piece of property, what do you need to do with the location of the building on the lot? How do you do your parking? How do you do the setup of the pedestrian walkways and how you connect to roadways around you? Common open space set-asides. If you'll recall back to the downtown sub-area plan last fall, there was a discussion once it got to the council about how much open space was being required, and the council was liking the increased amount for multifamily. And so they actually directed staff to start talking about requiring more open space for multifamily development across the city. So that's what that's going to be doing. Manufactured and mobile home standards, that's a new chapter for how those are going to be handled. Military zones, I've mentioned a couple times now. Essential public facilities, that is going to get a review and an update. Some of that has been around in the code for a while now, and just want to make sure that that's current with state rules, state court cases, and policies from the city council. And then again, at the bottom there, you see the wireless facilities and then the sign code both happening at the council level on a different track. So now if you were to go in your packet to page 19, I'm sorry, page 17, 18, okay. Start of attachment B, I'm sorry. You'll see 18A10, 120, and then 130 is on page 19, and then you'll see a map on page 21, and then you'll see 22 is 18A10, 140. So these are the zoning districts as of now, and then there's overlays within those districts or over on top of the districts, and that's what the map shows. And then 140 are sub-areas, and right now the only established sub-area in the city is the downtown sub-area plan, but there may be others in the future. So first and foremost, not only this tonight, but other things that we're going to be talking about in a moment are very much still preliminary draft. And if there are things that we're hearing from public stakeholder groups, we've had a couple of those meetings already, or as we move forward with other interested parties providing us comment, these are subject to change. And so if there are questions such as, again, what Mr. Spieth was mentioning tonight, where we need to clarify, or if there's been an unintended error, we're going to be making those changes, and then that would be the version you'll see later when you take action. I would also say, in reaction to what Mr. Spieth was saying, the intent is not to create a bunch of non-conforming uses in the city. The intent is to make this easier to use. The stuff that's on the ground now that's allowed is intended to continue to be allowed unless there's a very specific reason why not, and you'll be told that early on before you make your decision. So what I will be doing, and I commit to Mr. Spieth, is just making sure that his question, I get him an answer, and I think off the top of my head, but I don't want to go on final record with this, I don't think that there's going to be a problem, but we'll clarify and make sure that that's the case with the code. So within residential zoning districts, there you see R1 through R4, and then what it's going to be called on your maps or in the code. Then there's mixed residential, multifamily, neighborhood, business zoning districts, commercial classifications, industrial, military-related, public institutional, and open space. So all of these are pretty much what you have right now in the city, but it's been moved. So this is a classic example of just reorganization. Then you'll see the establishment of overlay districts, and there we have 3. So the flood hazard overlay, meaning you have however many zones in the city, and you may have kind of a flow of residential moving to commercial, moving to industrial. Well, where the floods go, don't care about that. And so an overlay is going to be on top of whatever zones happen to be there regarding land use, but where the floods, practically speaking, happen. So an overlay is in addition to the underlying requirements for whatever use you have on your property. This overlay is also going to apply. So you may have a commercial area zone, sorry, my hand is only so big. Right here, this is not flood area, and these commercial properties follow rule X, Y, and Z. Down here, it's a lower property, floods. These guys are going to have everything that these guys did, but they may have to build a little differently because the water's going to go there. And so in addition to their underlying zoning, there's this overlay and the rules that are applying in that overlay. Make sense? Same thing applies. You see there's a senior housing overlay in the city, and then the sexually oriented business overlay is also there. And the same thing applies. There's certain areas where the senior housing is going to be incentivized because that's where the city council ultimately said, we think it makes sense to have this type of development here. We're going to make it easier and more profitable for a development to come in of senior housing, for instance. And then the sexual oriented business overlay is because of state law and case law and the city's decisions as to where other things go, these types of businesses can only go here, here, and here in your city. So if you then jump to page 21, you'll see a map, and that just shows you where all of these overlays are. So you've got pink is the flood hazard areas, the pink with the stripes is the floodway areas, and then the green stripes is the senior housing overlay. So that is where the council has said, this is where it makes sense to make senior housing a little more attractive to build. We would like to have it nearby services, nearby the downtown core, transportation access to mass transit, for instance. So that's why they've done that there. And then again, the sexually oriented businesses are the purple, and there's only specific areas in the city where that type of business is allowed. So regardless of what the underlying zoning is, these things also apply to those parcels. Make sense? Okay. And then the sub-areas we talked about already. The downtown sub-area plan, as Councilmember Brandstetter said, is its own chapter, its own title, because it's so recent and it's its own enclosed thing. It's not being affected really by the 18A changes. It's going to sit as it is. If there's any cross-referencing, that'll all get updated, but otherwise the downtown plan is going to stay the same.
Affordable housing.
Uh-huh.
Where would that fall in this whole thing? I mean, so if I wanted, you know, I mean, multifamily zoning somewhere, and then if I had some requirement to put affordable housing in, how would that be? How would I learn that? How would I know that? And do I have to comply, or are there ways to get around it?
This will be a long-winded answer, so I apologize ahead of time. There's a couple ways the city is dealing with affordable housing right now. First of all, there's what's called the multifamily tax exemption. So there are maps within the code and the comprehensive plan that say, in this triangle of the city, if you do a multifamily project that goes above and beyond what's required by code, the city council can decide to give you a break on your taxes for so many years. And so that would then incentivize multifamily projects within those areas. And the assumption to some level is that the multifamily is going to be more affordable than single-family development. There's also, though, things like the habitat projects, which have happened in Tillicum, where they are purchasing property and building a certain way, and their model of building lets them keep their costs down, and the city may provide some sort of incentive to them. I'm not sure exactly what was done between the city and Habitat for those projects, but there are things called developer agreements where somebody could come in and say, we're going to do this, and in return for doing this and promising we keep it this way for a long time, you're gonna give us a break on taxes again, or you're gonna reduce our fees that we have to pay at the start. So there's developer agreements, which might be a way that the city could go. There's also, in certain codes, permit reductions for certain types of housing, and affordable housing is a common one. So if you're building something that's below the area median income, a certain section of your multifamily project, say you're gonna, by deed, say this is below market rate, it has to stay that way for so many years, you may get also a break on the way you're charged your fees or assessed taxes over time. So I apologize, I can't give you a specific answer with exactly what Lakewood does right now, but those are different ideas and different techniques. And then there's also inclusionary zoning, which I'm not sure if that's where you're headed. Lakewood doesn't have that at this point, but inclusionary zoning is the idea that usually it's multifamily, but it's a project, residential, is required by ordinance, by code, to say, for ease of math, I'm building 100 units, 20 of them have to be below market rate, and it's on the title that it has to stay that way for 50 years. You can do market rate on all the rest of your project, but this stuff is gonna be required to be like that because of the city. And if I'm remembering right, Seattle did this recently, where they upped the ante on affordable housing and inclusionary zoning. Right now, the city does not do that.
So that, that makes sense from an apartment point of view. What about a condominium where all of a sudden the people come in, they get in below the rate, and, you know, most people when they buy something, they want to, you know, the American dream, right? Have a house, it's going to appreciate. How do you tell some citizen that's bought a condo, say, that's below, that they can't sell it for more than X at some time in the future? I mean, is that what's going to happen in this?
That is not what's happening with any of this, what's being proposed right here. That is a question that gets asked by inclusionary zoning jurisdictions and people that deal with that issue. Pierce County for a while was talking about that, and again, I don't know how Seattle's handling it in great detail, but you're right. If somebody comes in, the benefit for them, if you were to be a proponent of it, is they're able to get in there at all. They're paying less up front, and because they're paying less up front, they're gonna get less out at the back end. If you're coming in and doing the regular market rate type of purchase, you're putting more down in the beginning, you're staying there for as long as it appreciates, and then you're able to take that away. So it's kind of an equity question, more so than just money.
Yeah, well, I mean, the city of Lakewood, in a sense, down in the Tilcom area, they've got a lot of the Habitat for Humanity homes are coming in, so people are getting in at a good rate. Are they gonna get to take advantage of all that appreciation, or?
From what I understand, they get a percentage of it, but they don't necessarily get all of it. But please take that with a grain of salt. I believe that's the model, but I couldn't give you any more detail than that.
Is that controlled by what we're doing?
No, no. Habitat does its own system of, they vet the people, and if you qualify for whatever type of project you're involved in the building, and that's part of the equity that you get. And then they have requirements that are placed on the deed for how long it needs to stay below market rate, or how they are gonna be able to pull equity out over time. If they stay there longer, I think they get more of a percentage out. So that's the idea, to help stabilize a neighborhood as well.
Okay. Thank you.
Madam Chair.
Any other questions?
Madam Chair.
Yes, Councilmember Brancetter.
Let me just briefly address the condominium question Mr. Wagman had, and that's really not something that the city is looking to deal with putting a lot of regulations in, because review of condominium regulations is something that is actually percolating in the legislature this session, and the city is monitoring what they're doing. And the city's position in our policy manual on that is that current state law around condominiums and of incentivizing and getting new condominiums built provides a disincentive to do that. And so the city's position is, we're monitoring, but that something should be changed. And if something should be changed in a way that would make that actually a realistic option for development things in places like doing that. So, you know, I don't see, it seems like it's very premature for the city to begin to try to figure out our own rules, because it goes back to, we're hoping for the good idea from Olympia.
I got a question, Connie. So I remember 2 years ago, we were talking about tiny homes. That kind of falls, I think, under what we were talking about. Do we have some provision for that in here, or is that going to be another discussion? I don't remember what we decided with that.
There are cottage housing sections of the code. So Lakewood allows what are called cottage houses, but those are relatively large compared to the tiny homes that have since come on the market. And that is something that is not included in this code right now. But it's a great way for me to be able to explain that one of the things that's happening is we're doing this big update, and there's brackets around it. And there are people at our stakeholder groups, and maybe it's members of the Planning Commission or Council, are gonna wanna start adding other things to the mix. And in order to get this done, the way we're gonna handle any new topics, whether it be tiny houses or some folks have been asking about the tree preservation sections of the code, is to call them a parking lot issue, and not a physical parking lot or part of a code related to that. But those things are gonna be talked about on the next round. So we're gonna get through this, we're gonna have a new and improved code just to work from as a base, and then topics that get raised by anyone through this process that need their own consideration are gonna come up maybe next year, or however many years it takes. So tiny houses certainly could be one of them.
Anyone, Commissioner?
I have another question about the tiny houses. So
Sure.
currently in the city of Lakewood, if somebody has a tiny house parked on the side of their house, is it considered like an RV, so they're just allowing it to happen?
I think what's gonna define whether it's an RV or whether it's an ADU or whether it's its own single-family detached structure is whether it is connected to water, power, sewer, and whether it's permanently set there or if it's on wheels. So it would be a case-by-case analysis.
So if one was to have one that's just sitting there attached to a house, I just see one
Sure.
when I'm in my neighborhood.
Yeah.
Not that I have an objection to it, because
Yeah.
it's fine, but, so they're just allowed to have that there because it's like, it's on wheels and it's attached to the main house.
I couldn't answer that for you specifically. That might be a code enforcement issue,
Okay.
where someone could come and take a look at what's going on and see if it's something they may have already actually gotten a permit for, or if there's a permit required, or if it's a different situation.
Any other questions?
I just-
Commissioner Wagner?
So in a sense, we're gonna go to some point, and it'll be a living document as we move forward.
Yes.
Through some amendment process as we
Yes,
go.
yes.
Okay.
This is such a large undertaking that there are going to be unintended consequences. There's going to be things left out. There's going to be stuff that we should have changed that we didn't. It's still in here. It's just going to take a couple of cycles probably once it's adopted to work out all the kinks. We're certainly doing our best to take care of them ahead of time. But there's got to come a point where we say, this is what we're going to talk about this time in order to just get it done. And then the other issues will be picked up later.
And if there's mistakes, we just blame them on Connie, right?
Yeah.
Thank
She was
you.
chair that night.
Any other questions? Okay, thank
Okay.
you, proceed.
The last thing I wanted to make apparent and clear to you tonight is starting on page 23 of the code, or excuse me, your packet, is now attachment C. And this is the land use and interpretation chapter as it reads right now. So in your stuff on your screen, you'll see, just for an example, this is 3 pages worth of text trying to explain, if you jump to page 25, what that one table says. And so the idea with a lot of the changes you'll see regarding the land uses and interpretation tables is taking pages and pages of text and trying to simplify it into one page of a table that says exactly the same thing, that something's permitted or not, or it's conditional. And then following each table for each type of use, there are footnotes that apply to specific subcategories. So At the beginning there on page 23, you'll see all the different types of uses broken down: agricultural, commercial and industrial, eating and drinking, etc., down the line. And then you'll see a purpose and an interpretation just to explain what all this stuff means. And then those tables start on page 25. And then with each section within this chapter, each type of use category is explained. And you'll see across the table R1, for instance. So again, I'm looking on page 25 for agricultural. R1, R2, R3, R4, and across. Those are all the zones within the city. And so if you were to look, I want to do a commercial beekeeping operation, I like bees, I'm going to see, first of all those Ps through the residential areas. So they are allowed outright. Someone could have a hive in a residential area. If you start to get over into the commercial and industrial areas, those are Cs, and that means it's a conditional use. So it would need to be reviewed and considered, and a decision would need to be made whether to allow whatever they were trying to do. Open space, again, it's something that's permitted outright. The other thing you see with commercial beekeeping is a number 1 following it. And if you jump down, you'll see under subsection B, you'll see 1. And that's where you'll find all the extra detail about commercial beekeeping. So it gets going, and it actually goes on for quite a while. But that is explaining the way this whole table and whole chapter is going to be laid out. You're going to have particular uses within a subchapter. You'll see whether it's allowed or not. So again, let's go back up to the table. Let's look at residential beekeeping. That one is allowed in the residential zones. But you'll see across where it gets to the commercial and industrial stuff, there's just a dash, and that means it's not allowed. So you can't ask for special permission with a conditional consideration. It's just, that's not going to happen, partly because it's called residential beekeeping, and if you're not in a residential zone, that's not the use, so it's not allowed. But if you're going to go through all of these chapters, they're all laid out the same way. You'll see the table, you'll see yes, no, or maybe, and then you'll see the little numbers after particular terms refer to footnotes that follow the table. So hopefully that will become much more user-friendly quickly for people that access this code. The other thing that I did not provide for you tonight, it'll be one that comes to you next meeting or maybe the one after, is, and this again I think goes to Mr. Spieth's questions tonight, all of these terms, so again on that agricultural table, commercial beekeeping, growing and harvesting of crops, and on down, those are all going to be defined in the definitions section of this new Title 18. So if you were to look at the definitions and then a particular chapter, you should be able to get all of your questions answered. So if you're not sure, what's the difference between residential beekeeping and commercial beekeeping? You would be able to go to the definitions section and it would lay it out. The other thing that it would do, so that if you jump ahead with me to page 29, you'll see that now we're into the commercial and industrial uses. And you'll see, for instance, accessory retail or services or artisan shop. If you're not sure what either one of those or any one of these would mean, you would go to the definitions section and it would say, this use is allowed, this use is allowed, this use is allowed. So you can see this one table, and if it's just not totally clear to you whether what you're wanting to do is allowed or not based on that term, you would go to the definitions section and it would clarify for you. So I was trying to find maybe accessory retail or services. Does that include antique shops? I don't know. If it does, then that's the row of the table that would apply. If it's you want to do a bank, you're going to be able to see pretty clearly where you're allowed to do that, where you're not. If you've got a brewery, there's certain areas where you can do it for sure. There's a lot of them where there's a no, there's that dash, and then there's conditional uses in the NC2, TOC, CBD, and the commercial 2 zones. So again, hopefully this becomes pretty easy to use as soon as someone starts to familiarize themselves with it. So this chapter, again, has all of the sections listed right under 010 there on page 23, all laid out the same way. The last one I would point out to you tonight is the very last one, which is 18A 4160, and let me give you a page number, 83 of 85, so almost at the end of your packet. It's mentioned as marijuana, but what is here is the decision that was made by the city council last year to prohibit marijuana altogether. So this section looks a little different from the other ones because this is a prohibition.
Commissioner Wagner.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Back up to that page 25 again.
Sure.
it says raising or keeping animals for agricultural purposes. Then it has a 3 in parentheses. So that takes you right to the section about beekeeping.
If you go to number 3, you would be jumping over to page 27, and there's a 3, and it's talking about activities associated with raising and keeping of animals. And then that continues on to the next page as well.
So you go to page 27.
Yep, there's a number 3 there at the bottom. That's the 3 that it's referring to.
Oh, okay.
Did you go to sub 3 within the beekeeping stuff?
So, okay, but you could have taken you to, well, you've got there's another 3, if you go to page 26, there's a 3 with a parenthesis around it too.
I got you.
So how do you stop that confusion?
Yeah, what I would actually suggest happen here is that we clarify the numbering up in the table to where you know that you're going to be sub 3, not just the first 3 that you come across. So we can fix that.
Okay,
No,
that
it makes
was my
sense.
question. I was trying to say, how do you get to where you need to get to?
Yeah,
All right.
yeah, no, I appreciate that. That's something that we can fix.
Any other questions or comments? Ms. Guerrero?
So is it the intent at this point that the table only takes the information from allowed and disallowed uses and puts it in the table, or have some changes been made to the table at this point?
Some changes have been made to some of the tables. Others are exactly the same. And so we'll get into that in more detail later on to show you where the substantive changes have happened. I just wanted to provide you tonight with the idea that this is the new look. This is the new way that this is all going to be read. But yes, some of them are the same, some have changed.
Gotcha. And it's just a typo on page 24.
24?
Item E says if the symbol dash appears in the box at the intersection of the column and a row, the use is allowed, and it should be not allowed, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions?
So that is what I had for you this evening in terms of content for you to look at. Where we're at process-wise is we're continuing the weekly sit-downs of staff. We're taking a look at this, trying to catch some of the things that you found tonight as well as others. There were 2 stakeholder meetings held in January. We're going to do that again sometime between now and March 5th. We're going to ask, again, people that have been involved with development in Lakewood so they know the code, as well as just the general public, to take a look at this stuff and give us reaction. And then, as I mentioned at the start, there's going to be a series of meetings for you to take a look at this in bite-sized pieces. You have a public hearing at this point scheduled for April 17th, and then potentially action on May 15th. At any time, this is huge. If at any time you feel like you need more time, please let us know. We're happy to accommodate that. This is just the tentative schedule for now.
So at this juncture, we need to annotate these in our calendar.
Yes, that'd be great. There will be one meeting on March 20th where you're going to have enough other things on the agenda that we figured you could take a break from this, but that meeting will still be held. So that's your first foray into 18A.
Commissioner Wagaman?
So I see the schedule. We'll get things to read. When will we get pieces that we can really look at and just read word for word and, wordsmith and look for errors like James found? And
each one of those meetings, you're going to get sections of it. And so you're welcome to do that as you get your packet each time. And anytime you see something that needs editing, please speak up or send us a message or however you would normally do that. Yeah.
So we'll get them prior to the meetings.
So should we have done that with some of the stuff here? Should we have?
That wasn't the intent with this presentation tonight. We'll make it clear when there's a section maybe you should focus on. That would make it easier for you, I'd imagine, if we could say, please pay special attention to this because there are substantive or policy changes.
And so once it goes through this whole process, they'll be final, but they're your almost final draft, I guess, at this point in time, once we see those.
They are still preliminary, I would say. What you're going to get, because your public hearing is April 17th, what we could try to do is, if April 3rd you're having a regular meeting, by the end of that week, so let's say it's April 5th, It would give you 2 weeks to take a look at the package that will be seen for the public hearing. And by that time, you're gonna be familiar enough with the topics and which section of the code you really need to pay attention to, because there's changes that will affect applicants or the process, and we can make that clear to you. But otherwise, you're gonna get, this meeting is gonna talk about X. These are the sections of the code we're bringing before you. Most of this might be verbatim, but here's where there's differences. And then it's up to you how you would spend your time and focus on where you want to read. That's the idea. Okay?
Anyone else? Thank you so much.
All right, thank you.
So, Councilmember Mike Brunstetter, do you have anything to share?
The council did take or move forward on a number of actions that might be of interest to the commission. With respect to the interim regulations for wireless facilities, the council did adopt some interim regulations, and on Monday of this week, we held the necessary public hearing that essentially is a step to allow for input as to whether those regulations should remain in effect or be authorized to do that. And so we did receive input from 2 wireless companies and 1 citizen. And I expect at a future meeting we'll decide whether that input is going to cause us to do any change to the interim regulations. But interim regulations are tied to the 18A process, in that it wins as we work through 18A and you do that, one of the sections there is going to be essentially making whatever comes out of that into permanent regulations of when the interim regulations will end to do that. So that has moved in that direction. Another area that you may be interested in is that this Public Works and Engineering staff has been working with landowners and stakeholders around American Lake with respect to how are we going to react to the invasive presence of milfoil in the lake that is something that is just in recent years presented itself. And the strategy being looked at is to move forward with, first of all, obtaining some grants and some research to be able to do some treatment in the lake that will control milfoil. And the mechanics is to create a lake management district. The other major lakes in the city actually have lake management districts that have membership of all the property owners on the lake, Lake Steilacoom, Lake Louise, Gravelly Lake. American Lake does not. It's a bit more complicated because it's not predominantly private property owners, but there's a significant mix of federal and state, a little bit of city property, but and some to do that, and it's a much larger lake. So, and they've never had a problem like this before that caused them to move forward to create a district. But the idea is we're looking to do that work in the first half of this year to get a district proposed that then that then a vote of property owners on the lake would then be, would approve it, which would then provide some mechanism of a funding stream to augment funding from the federal and state folks to address as necessary, you know, the aquatic vegetation problems in that lake before it gets out of hand or is significantly unsafe. I guess you know, we're as I mentioned earlier, where there's a whole variety of bills in Olympia that we're monitoring or that we've taken a position on to do that. So we're really early. We're still within just a month into the legislative session, and we're, you know, so many bills been introduced. We're just waiting for enough of them to die so we can really focus on the ones that are left. But I would say that the mayor, the deputy mayor, and the city manager today, okay, are in Washington, D.C., and they are working to try to encourage to get federal action and federal funding for a number of things that would go on. And two things that are of significance perhaps to the commission is that we are looking for transportation funding that would become available to communities that border military installations. And we are particularly interested in positioning ourselves and being competitive for that funding should it become federally available for the corridor from Lewis North and traffic that goes from there and up to Washington Boulevard, and then from Washington Boulevard to Nyanza. So that's one of the things that we're doing. And another priority that they're looking to, you know, build some support on is that over the past couple of years, the city and the South Sound Military Communities Partnership was pursuing the possibility of doing a land swap of where property in the clear zone north of McCord Field would revert to Department of Defense ownership, and that the Department of Defense would make available some comparable acreage that they would then turn over to a local government, ideally the city of Lakewood, that we would then further sell to make the property as a revenue source to then help build some new industrial or commercial areas and to do that. After more than 2 years of work on that, okay, it's just not going to happen. And the reason for that is that there just isn't any property that is not environmentally critical to the point of being prohibitive for development that is excess to the needs of JBLM that they could swap to us in exchange for that. So we're now looking for a number of alternatives to try to find some funding to relocate and clear the clear zone. And those actions are taking place in Olympia, but also that will be one of the focuses of the mayor and the city manager and the deputy mayor while they're in Washington, D.C. this week. That's all I have, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councilmember. Any comments or reports from the commissioners? Anything else from the city?
Just to say that next meeting for the Planning Commission is going to be preceded right before by an open house regarding the Shoreline Master Program. So you're all more than welcome to attend that. It starts at 5:30 and will wrap up before your meeting begins. And then on the agenda for you on the 20th will be both 18A and your Shoreline Master Program.
So that starts at 5:30 and ours starts at 6:30.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Is that the 20th?
Yes.
Okay.
Any other comments? Okay, meeting adjourned.
Good job, Connie.
Good job, Connie.
I'm glad she has that stick over by Nancy instead of me, because it would smash my.
Wrap your knuckles.